In today's discussion, we'll be deep diving into Spiral Mountain, collecting music notes and getting jiggy with it as we head into the world of Banjo-Kazooie on the Game Boy Advance with Banjo-Kazooie's Grunty's Revenge. This is a fantastic Game Boy Advance game that did a sterling job of bringing N64 style 3D platforming to Nintendo's 32-bit handheld, but is somewhat lost to time, having never been re-released or got the kudos I think it deserves. So, welcome to Rare Treats Episode 1. I'm ready to talk some mumbo jumbo as we head into the Game Boy Advance and Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge. In the early days of 3D video games, there was perhaps no bigger and more important genre than the 3D platformer. Super Mario 64 was the killer app for the N64, and all the competition had to try to play catch-up with that game. Sony PlayStation, of course, got Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon, and the Sega Saturn got Nights into Dreams, and Sonic Extreme, or, well, at least they tried to have Sonic Extreme, but they failed to get a 3D Sonic game off the ground properly until Sonic Adventure for the Dreamcast. The point is that it was really seen as vitally important to have a winning 3D platformer that would rival Nintendo's masterpiece in Super Mario 64. As it turned out, for all the attempts that the likes of Gex and Croc and Bubsy tried to do in 3D to up their game to compete with Mario, the best Mario alternative came from Camp Nintendo in the form of Rareware's Banjo-Kazooie. When it released in 1998, I was convinced it was a Super Mario 64 beta, and for me it was exactly the 3D platformer I had expected from the guys who had made the Donkey Kong Country series. Huge amounts of humour and personality, googly-eyed characters, and fantastic creative gameplay that was a joy to play. Famously, Banjo-Kazooie teased its sequel, Banjo-Tooie, within its ending, and fans were desperate for more. Technically, though, Banjo-Kazooie actually has two direct sequels. The first, of course, is Banjo-Tooie, which released on the Nintendo 64 in late 2000 in the US, and we didn't get it here in the UK, I think, until around March or April 2001, as one of the final N64 games released on the platform. The other game, of course, was this, Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge, which is set between Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie, and so is actually a more direct sequel to the first game that leads into Banjo-Tooie. This, along with Banjo Pilot, were two Banjo games released for the Game Boy Advance, but whilst both were announced before Rareware were sold from Nintendo to Microsoft, neither released until a fair bit later, and in the UK at least, it wasn't even released by Rare, it was published by THQ. And yes, I do know that Banjo Pilot was originally called Diddy Kong Pilot, so that wasn't even originally intended to be a Banjo game. In Grunty's Revenge, you are faced with Klungo, desperately trying to save Grunty from under the boulder she was squished under at the end of the first game. The story then unfolds that her ghost will inhabit a mecha robot version of herself, and she then will time travel to the past and kidnaps Kazooie. And I think the plan was to stop her own fate from the first game. I'll be honest, this could have been a great Terminator-like story where you have to save baby Banjo and baby Kazooie and had lots of time travel elements and reference to the future games, but it really doesn't unfold that way. I mean, why take Kazooie to the past from the present instead of just killing her in the past? It would be like Arnold Schwarzenegger arriving in Terminator 2 with the adult John Connor and saying, "This is you as a little boy, now watch as I terminate him." It would have just been completely redundant to take the older John Connor back. So why did Gruntilda take the older Kazooie back to the past? It wouldn't actually stop her from being killed and then turned into a ghost and becoming a mecha version. The fact that they also had a robot version going to the past was just a big wasted opportunity for some Terminator references. Now, luckily, Mumbo Jumbo is there to use his magic and send Banjo back to the past to be able to rescue Kazooie. And this is where the game gets interesting. For the first entire world, you only play as Banjo. It takes a good long while before you are reunited with Kazooie, and this does give that Banjo-Tooie experience of just playing as Banjo alone. But you don't get to play as just Kazooie alone, and there's no playing as Mumbo Jumbo in this game. But this was probably done as a little bit of a preview of some of the ideas that would come up in the sequel. Now, what's strange is that you can complete the first level with, I think, everything collected despite not having Kazooie. Now, wouldn't it have made more sense that you could only do so much just as Banjo, and then once you are reunited, you have to go back through the stage again, and this time you can access new areas and feel just kind of overpowered now that you can run faster and flap across areas and have extra attacks that Kazooie brings? I mean, maybe it's a good thing they didn't do that, because after all, this is a Rareware game, and Rareware heavily criticised for Donkey Kong 64 needing players to revisit stages over and over and over again as all of the different Kong characters. In Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge, it still very much follows the formula from the first game. You go about themed levels collecting Jiggies and music notes, and you will also get a Mumbo Jumbo token so you can transform into other things. This includes the likes of a squid, a mouse, and a candle. Yep, you can transform into a candle in this one. Unlike on Banjo-Kazooie, you can choose which of the transformations you want on any of the stages. And again, this feels underutilized, as it could have been a way to access new areas on earlier levels once you've unlocked later transformations, but it really doesn't lean into this very much. It's also of note that the Mumbo tokens are awarded to you when you beat a level's boss, rather than just finding the tokens hidden about on the levels like you would in the first game. Oh, and when you do get a Mumbo token, the icon used for it in the game is a thing of nightmares. This is also strange then that you are expected to continue searching the level after beating the boss, and this feels a little bit anticlimactic. I mean, you could get Jiggies mostly in any order on the original game, and so face the boss character of any level early, but this game definitely makes it so the boss fights aren't the final challenge, because until you've beaten it, you won't get that Mumbo token. The beach-themed level, Breegull Beach, feels just like the opening level of Banjo-Kazooie, and having swamp and haunted house kind of areas in Bad Magic Bayou and Spiller's Harbour also feel so familiar. They did a great job of making this play exactly like the full 3D games, even though this is just played from an isometric view. Instead of meeting Bottles the Mole to teach you new moves as you do in the first game, you meet Boss-Eye, which of course is a pun on him being boss-eyed, which means he's got one eye that looks a slightly different direction to the other, which I guess is another kind of pun like they had with Bottles, being a pun on the fact that he's got the bottoms of bottles as glasses, and then jam jars being another term for the same thing in Banjo-Tooie. Just like in the other games in the series, you'll occasionally meet characters who will require you to complete a fetch quest to get a Jiggy, and sometimes you'll also have to complete a mini-game. In the game there are either target-based shooting mini-games or ones which are basically like fishing, where like you might be fishing for sheep or something, and doing these kind of mini games will nab you a Jiggy. Having the transformations also provide variations to the gameplay, and there is one puzzle where the candle version of Banjo has to light certain small candles in front of picture frames, and this took me a while to solve as I couldn't figure out the logic of what the picture frames were indicating. Through trial and error though, I got there in the end. I'm truly impressed at how much this game stays true to the original game, and I can't really think of almost any cut ideas. There aren't as many moves and you won't be flying around as Kazooie, but you can still swim underwater and you can do all of the other kinds of moves, jumping, flapping, pecking, shooting things. I'd have rather there were flying sections than swimming sections, but fortunately there aren't big underwater levels, as frankly I almost always disliked the swimming levels on all kinds of games like Mario, Banjo, Tomb Raider, Zelda, Sonic. Whenever you're underwater, it just makes the gameplay slower, more difficult to control, and harder to explore. And then you'd often have the issue of, oh, you can't breathe underwater, so you gotta rush up to the top again. I just don't like swimming levels. Now, Bozai will slowly build up your moves as you collect enough music notes to pay for them, and throughout the game you'll gain the ability to use Kazooie as a shotgun and get various different types of egg ammo. This includes regular, fire, ice and electric, and these are used for various puzzles and enemies along the way. You don't get to explore Grunty's lair like you did in the original game, as it is still being constructed, although when you do get to go in there, it is literally right at the end of the game for the final challenges. Once again, you will have to complete a quiz as well as the final boss to see the ending. This feels like a missed opportunity for not being able to go all the way through the Gruntilda's lair, and perhaps even it being a time travel story, as you could have gone to earlier versions of levels that had been in the first game. And imagine if you'd actually met the original non-mecha version of Grunty and had to fight her. I mean, by all rights, she should be present in this game, but she isn't. It is literally just the mecha version. They could have also had a younger and the mecha Grunty team up against you, or they could have done something fun with the time travel element and had a fight with the young Grunty, explain why she's always had it in for Banjo and Kazooie. That would have taken things into a slight paradox territory, because if she always had it in because she fought them in the first place, then how did she originally have it in for them before they went back in time and fought her? But that is the fun aspect of time travel stories. Now, I am sad to say that there is no stop and swap features in the game, or any references to that I can find. Stop and swap was something said in the first game that would have played into Banjo-Tooie, where you'd be able to swap cartridges on the N64 between the two games to unlock hidden items like the multicolored eggs and the ice key. Now, as Nintendo updated the N64 hardware, this became impossible for Rare to implement, and so the stop and swap features were never really implemented into the games in the way they were originally intended. An updated version of these mechanics were later implemented into Banjo-Kazooie and Tooie's ports on the Xbox, and these were then tied into the release of Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. It's just a shame on the N64 they didn't make it so it used a memory card as an alternative option, because then it could have still played out the way they originally intended between Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie. Now, you have to believe that if Rare had stayed with Nintendo, Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge would have been the perfect way for Stop and Swap to still survive. I mean, if Banjo 3 had released on the GameCube as originally intended, then Grunty's Revenge could have connected to the GameCube via the Game Boy Advance to GameCube link cable. But heck, this didn't happen, and so c'est la vie. I still have my original Game Boy Advance cartridge of Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge, but weirdly, considering how much I like the original game, it's taken me just until recently to actually play it properly. I think the Banjo franchise suffered something of an early and unfortunate demise of sorts. As a late N64 game, Banjo-Tooie was mostly overshadowed by the launch of the PS2 and the final days of the Dreamcast. So poor Banjo didn't have the same impact as his original adventure did. Then, of course, the sale of Rareware to Microsoft probably left a lot of Banjo fans feeling a little bit burned by Rareware and still in Camp Nintendo. And then the Microsoft fans, well, they weren't necessarily people that would have been into Banjo-Kazooie. And then years later, when Rare did release Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, it was such a radically different game with angled graphics, which to many people completely lost the charm of the original games, and completely different gameplay. It was much more of a vehicle customization and racing-ish kind of game with only platform elements here and there. It was just too different to really properly revive the Banjo-Kazooie franchise. I did get Grunty's Revenge when it came out, but maybe some of the excitement for the release was gone now that Rare had left Nintendo. Also, truthfully, it's taken me years to really get into Banjo-Tooie even. I think Rare kept thinking bigger and bigger with their game worlds and collectathons was better, and they didn't ask themselves, should they go bigger, rather than can they go bigger. After Donkey Kong 64, I was disappointed that Banjo-Tooie was another ginormous interconnected world, instead of the tight, manageable playgrounds of the original. Well, I can say that playing Grunty's Revenge, I was pleased to find that the game is much more like the original than its sequel. This, of course, is probably down to the Game Boy Advance having some hardware limitations on how huge each level could be. But for me, this game feels much more like the original game than Banjo-Tooie does. I've always considered myself to be a big fan of Banjo-Kazooie, as well as all things Rare, but somehow this one had fallen to the back burner. I'm pleased to have taken the time to go through it and discover how good this game really is. It's a short game, but it is definitely one that Banjo fans won't be too disappointed by. It is just a short, sweet, little dose of more of the same of what you liked about the original. So that is going to wrap things up for this first part of Rare Treats, and I will have some more Rareware game coverage in the near future. Let me know in the comments what Rareware games you'd like to see me cover, because I'm going to try to go through all of the favourites and some more of the slight oddities. So if you haven't done so already, I would appreciate if you would smash that subscribe button here on the Geek Battle Gaming YouTube channel, and don't forget you can check out the article version of today's discussion over at www.xstreamed.tv/gaming. So with that, until next time, stay safe, always stay extremed, and ciao for now. Boom, and we're off the air. Gah.